Hello. I am very, very conscious that I am between you and your lunch. And this is a topic that is so dear to my heart, I could talk about it for hours, but I promise you I won't. And I'm sure if there are lots of questions, we can talk about that over lunch. But thank you for inviting me to talk, because I think this group is such an influential group. I don't think you realise just how powerful you are. Because what you are doing is setting new standards in ways of working. And I'm not going to pretend to tell you how to do that, because you're much better at it than I am. So when I was asked to speak today, I thought, what do I speak about? And I decided to speak about my perspective on all of this, as if I was still a practitioner, if I was still working for perhaps Marks and Spencer or Sainsbury's, because they are going to be absolutely fundamental to driving this agenda at the pace and the scale that we all know we want to drive it at. So I am not going to mention all the challenges and all the things that we could be doing. I'm going to talk about the things that really are pivotal as a practitioner, and my perspective on that. And the first one is the challenges. What you've got there is the 6th carbon budget. I think we're all eagerly waiting the 7th carbon budget, which is due out next February from the Climate Change Committee. I can tell you now, as a supermarket business, or indeed a food manufacturing business, they will not have looked at this. There is no relevance to, and I don't mean that in a negative way, it is just not on their radar, because the way that they're measuring their impact and the way that those targets are set out, they don't see the connection. So if you were to say to someone, okay, well, here's a budget that we're aiming for, this is what we need to deliver net zero, what does that mean for my business? There is a gap. And that's an opportunity, because there is the 7th carbon budget coming out next February. That's a big moment in time. And is that a big moment in time for this network to talk about how we might connect that up? The second piece, and it's touched on now, and I won't go into all of the details around it, but is the whole piece around net zero and the role of carbon removals and carbon offsetting. Again, hot off the press and funded by NERC, is the new guiding principles from Oxford University on what that looks like. And again, I'm thinking about businesses, thinking about the negative aspects of net zero when it's not communicated accurately or properly. How do we make sure that these kinds of things are embedded into everything that is going on, and using the network to help with that? Big opportunity this year, Scope 3 emission reporting will become mandatory. So Department of Business and Trade, DESNZ working together, setting that top level reporting mechanism. But clearly below a reporting mechanism has to be a reporting methodology. A lot's going on in that space. And the other thing, if you think about some of the challenges, is we talk a lot about our emissions and getting to net zero. What we don't talk about is our consumption. So these graphs, I mean, I know a few people have referred to Our World in Data, but that is my favorite website. You can get lost in there for hours and hours. But this is from Our World in Data, and what it shows is we've done quite a good job on reducing emissions, mainly through decarbonisation of the national grid. What we haven't done is a very good job on our consumption, because effectively we are offshoring our carbon emissions, particularly in the food system. What do we do about that? Well, we have to create a level playing field between the food that we produce here and the food that's imported. And we know trade deals and level playing fields are a hot topic for the agricultural community. But we also need to think about things that we should be doing around that, because basically greenhouse gas emissions do not know geographic boundaries. But we behave as though they do. So when we are creating emissions, we are creating emissions for the world. Next piece is obviously the double materiality. We have our emissions have an impact, but the climate and nature crises are having impacts on us. And again, businesses are not very good at understanding materiality, and mainly because they don't have the data to be able to do that. Sector guidance, and this is one of the things that I'm working on at the moment with some of my colleagues at DEFRA. If you think about how we are reporting on all of this, so you've got the International Sustainability Standards Boards that will create the reporting mechanism. You've then got the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Protocol creating the reporting methodologies. But what those reporting methodologies do at a sector level is quite basic. And we're not like automotive, as people have already mentioned today. We're not like aerospace. We're not a simple sector. And therefore, getting the sector guidance right, not just for the sector, but for the sector in the UK, is really important. So part of what will be coming that very specific sector guidance for UK food and farming. And that's good news, because again, it's part of creating that level playing field. And while all of this is going on, you've got people like Client Earth that are taking legal action on those companies, and indeed government, who are not doing enough on making sure they've got plans to achieve the targets that they've set themselves. And I say governments because clearly there was a judicial review, get that out, judicial review on all of this, because the view was the government in this country didn't have a good enough plan to achieve the legal targets that they've set for net zero. And then poor data, because none of this will work unless you've got good quality data. And I put this up here, and it's actually a piece of work from one of the agri-tech centres from CHAP that they did on horticulture. And horticulture is a massive challenge because, as we all know, a tomato grown in a glass house with energy from anaerobic digestion is very different from a tomato grown in a glass house on a combined heat and power electricity generator, etc., etc. But what you can see there is essentially the typical values for some horticultural products. You can see the lower limits, the top limits, and red, amber, green for degrees of confidence in the accuracy of the data. On what you can see there is no real confidence in the accuracy of the data. So that all sounds really depressing, but if I'm sitting there in Holborn in Sainsbury's or in Paddington at Marks and Spencer, these are the things that are troubling me. And as if that wasn't enough, that is just one transition. It's the transition to net zero. And we've talked a lot about systems thinking and what that means. And indeed, retailers do think systematically about things, perhaps not everything they should think about, but they do try to think holistically, because they need to make single interventions with multiple holistic benefits. And that means you have to be really thoughtful, and you have to have really good advice. And that's why this network is important as a part of really good advice to business. So the other transition is the transition to nature positive. So what you've got there is every business now worrying about TNFD. They've got TCFD, so Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures. They'll all have paid big consultants lots of money to help them with their TCFD reporting. They're now thinking about their TNFD reporting. The big difference, there are some similarities because the structure of TNFD is exactly the same as the structure of TCFD, i.e. governance, data and reporting, risk management, future strategy, really sensible. The big difference is nature does no geographic boundaries. So every single place is a unique combination of nature, climate, microclimate, water, communities, and very many different communities. So what needs to be done in a very specific place is very unique to that place. And that is a massive struggle for a retailer. And I use Sainsbury's as my example, sourcing from over 80 countries around the world, and not the same things at the same time. So, apples from Kent, apples from South Africa, apples from New Zealand, very many varieties following the climate and following the sun around the world. It is a massive task. So I say this because, essentially we've got nature that is being destroyed before we can discover its secrets. And we have got to make sure that we can capture all of this stuff as quickly as possible. So, and you know, the work that's going on various plants, and we've heard about fava beans and those kinds of things, that work is so important that we capture it. Next bit is really about the transition to a healthy and sustainable diet. And I could talk about how in my old life I would be thinking about how you drive consumer behavior, because anything that has to transition has to be a bit of market pull, so what do consumers want, as well as a bit of supply side push. So getting that push and pull right is really important. However, and this is quite a provocative statement to make, I think we know how to drive consumer behavior. There is brilliant work being done at the Consumer Data Research Centre at Leeds, with a lot of the retailers looking at various interventions, so incentives, pricing, promotions, things like Disney collectibles on fruit and vegetables, and how that grows fruit and veg consumption in young kids massively. So we do know what works to drive consumer behavior. But the point is, if we were to wave a magic wand tomorrow and every consumer woke up and said, today I'm going to eat everything that I should be eating, I'm going to double my intake of fruit and veg, I'm going to eat less cereals and starches, I'm going to get more fiber in my diet, the world would not be able to produce that food. So, you know, what that shows is basically on the left-hand side, roughly what the world is producing. That's quite old data, but it hasn't really moved very much. And on the right-hand side, the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate, which is really just a good common sense, bit like the Eat Well guide, good common sense piece. And the reason this is the real elephant in the room is because we've got a fragmented food system. So left-hand side, 500 million smallholder farmers producing off small plots of land, 35% of the food that we consume. So the tea, the coffee, the cocoa, the rice, the bananas, even palm oil to a certain extent. And on the right-hand side, you've got the 11 big brands, global brands that control, in this country, about half of what we eat. And I'm not making any comment about that, but if we are to make this supply chain fair and equitable, we have got to do something about joining up the food system in a way that we've never done before. And the problem is a lot of that visibility right up to those 500 million smallholder farmers doesn't exist, because it stops at these points of consolidation. And that's where the unlocking those points of consolidation, that's where the opportunity is. And again, if I'm thinking about this from a retailer perspective, there is now a greater requirement from a due diligence point of view to have that visibility all the way through the supply chain. I was listening to the collective insurance point and thinking there is something in this around who takes the risk. So think about extreme weather events, think about climate change. In that supply chain, who is taking most of the risk, and how can that risk be shared? And again, all sorts of things around long-term commitments and contracts, lots of things around looking at costing models that, again, share that risk along that supply chain. But we're not doing nearly enough in this space to make a transition really helpful. And then at the other end, we didn't even talk about who sits in the middle of all of that, but you look at the global trade in agricultural commodities and the big players in there, and what happens in that space, and that is one of those interesting points of consolidation. And again, this is pretty invisible to most people. Lots of these companies nobody would have ever heard of. They're not household names like Nestle or Mars. These are companies that really are managing the global trade. It's a really interesting report. Don't need to read it all, just read the exec summary from OECD, which talks about how changes in global trade could really help to mitigate some of the really extreme consequences of climate events. The question is, does the way that the world trades with each other and the way that operates, have they got the appetite to do some of the things that are in this report that will make sure that some of, let's say, extreme consequences of climate don't play out? I'm going to talk about fruit and veg for a bit. I'm just conscious of the time. Talk about fruit and veg for a bit because for me, this is one of the biggest challenges we've got in this country. And global trade in fruit and veg, again, this graph basically shows tomatoes, bananas, potatoes, grapes, and raisins along the bottom, and then other, which is everything else, in the grey. And clearly other is where all the growth is coming because we're eating a greater variety of things. But essentially, production of fruit and veg is something that this country really hasn't thought about very much. Horticulture has always felt a bit like the poor relation to agriculture from a livestock, dairy, arable point of view, even to the point that from an AHDB point of view, there is no actual H anymore because horticulture's gone off to do their own thing. It's the biggest trade gap. I think last time I looked, it was about 11.5 billion. And it's the thing that we need to be eating more of. And if you look at some of those commodities, it's a classic 80-20 rule. Again, you probably can't see this very well, but for each of those commodities, tomatoes, bananas, you've got essentially the top exporting countries and the top importing countries. And I suppose what you see when you look at that is in most instances, there are 3 or 4 countries that are producing most of this fresh produce, which is unbelievably risky. But it also is unbelievably challenging because if that is the reality where you've got certain countries dominating, for example, Ecuador and bananas, if you've got those countries dominating, what does that mean from a climate risk point of view? But also go back to the magic wand and are we producing the food that we need to be eating? We need to be producing 3 times more fruit and veg globally than we're currently producing if everyone was to eat a healthy, planet-friendly diet. And that's just not possible with a business model and a supply base that looks like that. But of course, that's the opportunity, a real opportunity, and an opportunity in this country where we've got this massive trade gap. I don't think we have a strategy for it, by the way, but it's an opportunity. And a lot of that is about novel crops. So if you don't have that production capacity, you don't have a retrofitting problem, because retrofitting is always really difficult. It's costly. You look what happens when you want to move from petrol to diesel cars, and now we know that wasn't the right thing. And then you're moving from petrol and diesel to electric cars. That is very costly for the taxpayer, but it can be retrofitted. It's really difficult to retrofit the food system, really difficult. And therefore, quite a lot of what we do, Simon mentioned earlier, is we need to innovate our way out of this. And I use this as an example. It's the work from the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. And Kew is not just a nice garden in West London, it's a research institute supported by DEFRA with 450 scientists and working in 100 countries around the world. And basically, they know what's edible, they know what gets used, they know that there are plant species that are important. And every year, with their state of the world's plants and fungi, they are identifying new species previously undiscovered. So there is opportunity out there, and we need to capture, going back to the diversity point, we need to capture all of this. But it's not just the opportunity of new plants and innovation in that space. It's also an opportunity to build resilience. So if you think about the challenges, we've got black sigatoka virus on bananas, we've got greening virus on citrus fruits. Some of these varieties are climate resilient. So Kew have discovered a 3rd species of coffee. So you've got Arabicas and Robustas, but they've also found Coffeus stenophila. It's a bit like an Arabica, not quite as nice as Arabica, but it can grow at temperatures up to 7 degrees warmer than current coffee crops. If you're in Ethiopia, where their coffee yields have collapsed, and it is a major part of their income as a country, those new varieties are really, really important. But so building resilience, but we've got to do all of this while climate change is going on. And I like this slide. I would say that, wouldn't I, because it's my slide, but I like this slide for two reasons, because it really does point out what's happening on extreme weather. So this is 50 years of extreme weather events. So storms, droughts, flooding, you name it. There are a few things on there, but the majority, like earthquakes that don't really count, but there are a few things on there that really focus your mind. One is, in the last 50 years, the likelihood of an extreme weather event has gone up 10 times. Which means for us, the ETBS, which is the expected time between surprises, is going down. And why we are getting all of these climate surprises, it's distracting us from doing what we need to do. So with my Environment Agency hat on, I know my colleagues at the Environment Agency for the last 4 months have done nothing but worry about flooding. So all the other good work gets put on the back burner while this is going on. So we need to find ways of dealing with that ETBS, because we need much better incident management. And that's not just the nation, it's business as well. That means that we don't take our eye off the longer term prize. And then the other one that is troubling many of us is food safety. And again, somebody touched on it earlier. What is it that we can do to make sure that we're aware of all of the new risks that come with climate? And this is a piece of work that's been done on mycotoxins in wheat, maize. So with all of that, we've got some big enablers. Data. It needs to be really granular and it needs to be really good quality. And I use this example from the Consumer Data Research Centre at Leeds. It's called the Priority Places for Food Index. It's open source, you can look at it. They produced it with Which, basically to look at the cost of living crisis and to say, here is the cost of living crisis. There are many more vulnerable people from a food point of view as a consequence of the cost of living crisis, but that cost of living crisis is not evenly distributed. So basically, massive sets of data, bottom decile, bottom 10% of households in the UK that are extremely food vulnerable, top 10% not. If you're a supermarket and you've got customers with loyalty cards or you've got information around customers, you can invest disproportionately in customers that need it most. So if most of you have got a Tesco Club card or a Nectar card or any other kind of reward card, the owners of those reward cards can target you personally with your own promotions. That could be a force for good. It's not currently happening, but it could be, because the mechanisms are there. So data, really important. Food data transparency partnership, something that I'm working on, and this is about creating the data standards and the platforms to share data. There are 3 work streams. I'm working on the environment, there's health and well-being, which is the Department of Health and Social Care, and then the Food Standards Agency picking up the data standards and the platforms in order for that information to be shared. Again, all about creating a level playing field, and in this case, starting with greenhouse gas emissions, and then we'll be moving on to nature. Digitization of all of that. Don't know how many of you are aware, but there's a brand new barcode coming in. It looks like a QR code. It's slightly different to a straightforward QR code, but we won't go into that. 2027, all retailers and even some brands now, if you go out and look at things like Marmite, they're already using these new barcodes. These barcodes can link digital platforms together and can be scanned with a customer's mobile phone, scanned at the till, and different pockets of information can be basically protected from others. So that QR code could have information around where that product's come from, its nutrition information, its greenhouse gas emissions, all sorts of things. This is a game changer. And of course, the beauty of this, it's run by GS1, the people that own the current barcode. It's used in every country around the world, and every big brand and retailer uses the same format. And you can bespoke it to what you want to do. So if you're a Sainsbury's or a Tesco or a Marks and Spencer, you can decide what you want to put into that barcode and what you might want to share with your customers. Then there is the best science. There's a lot of science in this space, and it's a busy space. If you're a retailer and you're not a scientist, everyone is brilliant and everyone is a genius, and every bit of work is the best work that's ever gone on in that space. We have got to help business and signpost them to the best science and where the really leading edge thinking is, and that is a collective activity. And then engagement, public engagement. The good news in this is that citizen science has reached new levels. And again, the NERC Impact Awards, one of the winners of the impact was around a citizen science project on water quality in the River Wye. And anyone who knows about the issues around water quality in the River Wye will know why this public engagement project was so important. And this was really getting the public doing serious science through digital and mobile technologies. And it just is kind of the kind of engagement we need to see, where we have got our citizens involved in providing some of the solutions to some of the great challenges. And then networks. The panel discussion just now talked about how we create the stakeholder groups that are going to move the agenda forward, and whether that's politicians, whether that's investors, and Green Finance Institute. And by the way, the Green Finance Institute, working with TNFD, have got a consultation out at the moment. The consultation closes at the end of this month. If you've got strong views on that, make sure that your views are posted to that website, because it's really important that that consultation has good broad reach. But these networks are really, really important. And if we don't build them in a way that engenders collaboration, and collaboration is a very, very overused word, because it's a very hard thing to do, because it means you've got to spend a lot of time understanding the perspectives of lots of different people in order to get true alignment. And sometimes you have to go round the houses again and again, and it feels really frustrating, but there's no shortcut to that. So thinking about how to be truly collaborative. But of course, you've just made the most brilliant start over the last year or so. So for me, when I look at you all sitting here today, looking hungry for your lunch, what do I see? I see some collective wisdom on all sorts of topics that, whether the things I talked about with some people over dinner last night or the things I've listened to this morning. I think you're really good at understanding where the collective blind spots are. And I think some of the 2-minute pitches, I think, were really interesting. And I love I'm not picking out one, but I do love the collective insurance idea. I think you can consolidate your asks on the rest of the system, because there are lots of demands. And if you're sitting there as a business, you just want someone to give you, if you only do these 5 things, they will be the game changers. So what are those consolidated asks? What are those priorities? You can hold each other to account on all of this, and indeed others in the ecosystem, but also celebrate the small wins, because this is going to be a long transition. It's going to be a long journey, and people get tired, and sometimes it can be quite depressing. So let's find those small wins and celebrate them and shout them from the rooftops, because the biggest thing about climate and climate change and achieving net zero is giving people hope that it is actually possible. And that's really important. So I will leave you with lunch. The grandest challenge of our time. There is no greater challenge. We're the first generation to really understand it, and the last generation to be able to do anything about it. Thank you. And if you're interested, there's some further reading. Thank you very much.